The Grand City Library was a monument to time, wisdom, and history, towering over the city's bustling core with its Gothic architecture and massive stone columns. By day, the library thrummed with students, researchers, and curious visitors, each one navigating the maze of knowledge within. Tonight, however, it was different. The usual crowd had been replaced by a select group of the city's most influential legal minds, all drawn here for a private, high-profile conference on judicial reform. Despite the library's grand walls and intellectual reverence, a heavy silence filled the air, unsettling in its quiet but crackling with tension. Inside the library's hallowed halls, Amanda Jacobs moved confidently through the dim corridors. She was a woman who carried an aura of determination and sophistication, a blend of charisma and sharp intellect that marked her as a leader among her peers. Amanda was no stranger to rooms filled with high-stakes discussions. Having been raised by one of the nation's most respected legal minds, Judge Thomas Jacobs, Amanda had carved her own place in this world, not merely as Judge Jacobs' daughter, but as a skilled attorney in her own right, known for her fearless advocacy and dedication to justice. Even now, in the heart of this historic building, surrounded by the city's most powerful legal figures, she felt the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders. The conference was being held in the library's restricted archive section, a room few outside the elite legal circles ever had the privilege to see. As Amanda entered, the grandeur of the space struck her, though she was careful to keep her expression neutral. Rows upon rows of ancient, leather-bound legal manuscripts filled the walls, stretching from floor to ceiling. The musty scent of aged paper hung thick in the air, the aroma mingling with the subtle polish of oak furniture and the faint whisper of voices echoing from nearby. Here, in these hallowed archives, the nation's legal history was preserved, the victories, the losses, the forgotten and the unforgettable. Amanda found a seat at a large oak table in the center of the room, placing her hands lightly on a stack of documents she'd brought with her. Her eyes scanned the faces around the room. Most were older men, her father's contemporaries, men who had spent decades building and preserving the legal structures that shaped the country. Amanda recognized many of them, having met them at various legal events throughout her career. And while these men commanded respect, Amanda couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of disillusionment. She had sat through enough of these discussions to know how easily they could devolve into empty talk. Meetings like these often ended with grand ideals exchanged but little in the way of tangible action. Tonight, the topic was judicial reform, a subject Amanda was passionate about. Yet, as the discussions unfolded, covering everything from sentencing guidelines to anti-corruption measures, Amanda felt that familiar prick of frustration rising within her. She had listened to these same debates time and again, heard the same impassioned promises for change, and time after time, the promises faded, buried beneath bureaucracy and hesitation. But tonight, there was something different in the air, an undercurrent of urgency that Amanda couldn't quite place. She could feel it in the room, in the tense expressions of her colleagues and the hushed tones of their conversations. It was as if everyone sensed that something significant was within reach, a real shift, a chance for change that was rarely so palpable. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Amanda's eyes flicked upward, narrowing as the chandelier overhead dimmed momentarily before regaining its brightness. The room fell into uneasy silence, the lawyers and judges glancing at one another, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Amanda heard the faint murmur of concerned voices nearby, and even the oldest and most experienced among them looked unsettled. A judge seated to her right gave a dry chuckle, attempting to break the tension. "Must be the old wiring in this place," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Amanda forced a small smile in response, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Grand City Library was meticulously maintained, especially in areas reserved for important events like this one. Power malfunction seemed unlikely, too convenient. Just as the tension began to subside, the faint sound of an alarm hummed in the background, then grew louder, sharper, until it pierced the silence with a shrill, echoing wail. The fire alarm blared through the room, its relentless scream filling every corner and rattling even the steadiest of nerves. Startled, the attendees sprang into motion, their composed demeanor breaking as they gathered their belongings with a flurry of confused murmurs. Amanda rose quickly, her mind racing. This couldn't just be a simple malfunction. The timing was too coincidental, too perfectly aligned with the building tension. The library staff appeared swiftly, a librarian approaching them with a look of apology mixed with unease. "We need to evacuate the building immediately," she announced, her voice tight with stress. "There seems to be a malfunction in the security system, and we can't take any chances. Please follow the marked exits." Amanda slipped her notes and documents into her briefcase, her mind working as fast as her hands. She knew better than to ignore her instincts, and tonight, her instincts screamed that this was more than just a drill or a routine evacuation. As she followed the others down the library's corridors, the incessant blare of the alarm echoed through the darkened space, every sound amplified in the emptiness. As the group made their way toward the main exit, Amanda noticed something strange. The large, ornate front doors of the library, the same doors she had entered just hours ago, were now shut and locked. A few of the attendees exchanged frustrated glances, muttering in confusion. An elderly judge let out an exasperated sigh, his impatience rising with every second. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "A locked gate? In the middle of an evacuation." Amanda didn't share in their irritation. Instead, she felt a shiver run down her spine. Locked doors during an emergency evacuation. This was not standard procedure. Her instincts, sharpened by years of legal practice and an upbringing in a world of high-stakes decisions, told her that something was very wrong. While the others continued their complaints, Amanda discreetly slipped away from the group. She had spent countless hours in this library, both as a student and a professional, and knew there was a rarely used service exit at the back of the building. Moving swiftly but quietly, she navigated the dimly lit corridors, each step echoing against the cold marble floors. The alarm's shriek softened as she turned into a narrow hallway leading to the service door, which was slightly ajar. She pushed the heavy metal door open, feeling the cool rush of night air brush against her face as she stepped into a darkened alley behind the library. The alley was cloaked in shadows, with only a single, flickering street lamp casting a dim glow over the damp pavement. Amanda took a deep breath, the chill in the air momentarily grounding her. She was about to make her way down the alley when a sudden sound stopped her. A soft but distinct crunch of footsteps behind her. Her pulse quickened as she turned to face the figure emerging from the shadows. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and wearing a police uniform that looked almost too tight around his rigid frame. His hand rested on his holstered gun, and there was an unmistakable glint of authority and something darker in his eyes. "Amanda Jacobs," he said, his voice low and gruff. It was not a greeting, but a command. Amanda met his gaze, her own eyes steady, her instincts sharpening in the face of the threat. She recognized him as Officer Mark Reynolds, a patrol cop whose name had surfaced in hushed whispers for all the wrong reasons, a man known for his temper, his disregard for boundaries, and the heavy cloud of misconduct allegations that surrounded him. "What are you doing here?" Reynolds demanded, taking a step closer, his hand still lingering near his weapon. Amanda held her ground, her voice calm but firm. "I'm leaving the library. There was an evacuation order. I suggest you step aside." But Reynolds didn't move. His gaze flickered to her leather briefcase, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Amanda could feel the shift in his demeanor, the slow transformation from duty to dominance, a need to assert control over her that had nothing to do with protocol. In that quiet, shadowed alley, with only the distant hum of the city as witness, Amanda realized she was about to face something far more dangerous than a mere malfunction. The chill of the night air seemed to seep into Amanda's bones as she faced Officer Mark Reynolds, his figure cutting an intimidating silhouette in the dim glow of the alley's solitary street lamp. His posture was aggressive, his hand hovering just above the grip of his gun, fingers twitching as though eager to reach for it. There was an intensity in his stare, a mix of suspicion and something more volatile, that set every nerve in Amanda's body on edge. Reynolds' voice was low, almost a growl, as he addressed her. "You have no business here at this hour," he said, his gaze flicking from her face to the leather briefcase she clutched tightly in her hand. "What were you doing inside?" Amanda's spine straightened, her composure unwavering even as her heart raced. Years of navigating difficult situations in courtrooms had taught her the importance of keeping her cool, even in the face of intimidation. But this was different. This wasn't a controlled environment, and there was no judge to mediate the power imbalance before her. She was alone in an alley, facing a man whose very demeanor told her he would go to any length to establish his dominance. "There was an evacuation order," she said, her voice steady. "The library's security system malfunctioned. I'm simply leaving, as instructed." Reynolds' lip curled, a hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He took a step closer, his shadow stretching toward her across the damp concrete. "You expect me to believe that? A high-profile attorney sneaking out of a restricted area, carrying a briefcase like that?" His gaze settled on the briefcase, suspicion sharpening his eyes. "What's in there? Papers you don't want anyone else to see." Amanda could feel the tension coiling tighter with every word he spat, but she refused to flinch. "These are confidential legal documents," she replied calmly, meeting his gaze without wavering. "I'm afraid I can't show them to you without cause, officer, and unless you have a warrant." That's the end of the discussion. Reynolds' eyes darkened, his face twisting with barely restrained rage. He took another step closer, the air between them thick with hostility. "Cause?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't need a warrant when I've got probable cause, and you're giving me plenty of reasons to be suspicious." The intensity of his presence felt suffocating, but Amanda held her ground, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. Reynolds was clearly itching for a confrontation, but she wouldn't be intimidated. This was not her first time dealing with men who tried to use authority as a weapon, and it wouldn't be the last. "Officer," she said, her tone even but laced with steel, "if you believe I've committed a crime, you're welcome to arrest me, but I will not hand over my briefcase without legal justification." For a moment, the air stilled, the tension between them thick as stone. Amanda could see the flicker of frustration in Reynolds' eyes, the way his jaw tightened at her defiance. He was used to people shrinking under his glare, used to the instant compliance his position demanded. But she wasn't going to fold. Not here. Not tonight. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Reynolds hissed, taking yet another step closer until he was nearly looming over her. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper, barely audible over the faint hum of the city in the background. "You think you're above the law, don't you? A lawyer like you, waltzing around with your fancy words and your fancy briefcase. But out here, it's different. I decide the law." Amanda's pulse quickened, but outwardly, she remained composed. She knew better than to show weakness. "I'm not trying to be clever, officer," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "I'm simply aware of my rights. If you have no grounds to detain me, I'll be on my way." A flicker of pure rage crossed Reynolds' face, and in a swift motion, he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, his fingers digging into her flesh. The suddenness of the movement took her off guard, and a jolt of pain shot up her arm, but she refused to let it show. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression calm, her gaze locked onto his with unflinching resolve. "Let go of me," Amanda said, her voice sharper now, though she still maintained a controlled tone. But Reynolds didn't release her. Instead, he tightened his hold, pulling her closer, his face only inches from hers. She could feel the heat of his breath, sour and heavy, and she was struck by the pure contempt in his eyes. He wasn't just suspicious, he was angry. Angry that she had dared to stand up to him, that she hadn't folded under the weight of his intimidation. "You're not going anywhere," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "Not until I say so." For a moment, they stood locked in a silent standoff, the tension between them almost unbearable. Amanda knew she was in a dangerous position. She could feel the power radiating from him, the way he was on the verge of losing control. But she had come too far to back down now, and she knew that giving in to his demands would only embolden him further. "Officer," she said, her voice cold as steel, "if you continue this, I will ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions." Reynolds' face contorted with barely restrained fury, and before Amanda could react, he struck her, a sudden, hard slap that snapped her head to the side. The sting spread across her cheek, the force of the blow ringing in her ears. For a brief moment, the world seemed to tilt, her vision blurring as the impact registered. But she didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She slowly straightened, her gaze locking onto his with a quiet, smoldering fury that she knew he could see in her eyes. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice low and cutting, the pain in her cheek fueling her resolve. Reynolds stared at her, his face a mixture of defiance and something else, something that looked almost like fear. He had gone too far, and he knew it. He may have spent years getting away with behavior like this, but he had never encountered someone like her before. Someone who wouldn't quietly accept his abuse of power. Someone who would fight back with every fiber of her being. "Don't you dare threaten me," Reynolds spat, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. "You think you can talk to me like that and just walk away?" Before she could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the alley, drawing both their attention. Out of the shadows emerged a young officer, his face pale and uncertain as he took in the scene before him. It was Officer Thomas, a recent addition to the precinct, and the look on his face told Amanda everything she needed to know. He hadn't expected to find his superior engaged in such a confrontation. "Reynolds," Thomas called, his voice uncertain but firm. "What's going on here?" Reynolds stiffened, his expression shifting into one of irritation and frustration. "Nothing you need to worry about, rookie," he snapped, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Go back to your patrol." But Thomas didn't move. His eyes flicked from Reynolds to Amanda, his brow furrowing as he took in her flushed face and the determined set of her jaw. He could sense that something was very wrong, that whatever had happened here was far from routine. "Maybe we should call this in," Thomas suggested cautiously, his gaze shifting nervously between the two of them. "It looks like there's been a misunderstanding." Reynolds' jaw clenched, a muscle in his cheek twitching as he glared at Thomas. "I told you to go back to your patrol," he growled, his voice tinged with barely concealed rage. "I've got this under control." But Thomas didn't back down. He was young, and though he looked terrified, Amanda could see a flicker of resolve in his eyes. He knew that what he was witnessing was wrong, and he wasn't about to ignore it. "Reynolds," Thomas said again, his voice firmer this time, "I think you've gone too far." Amanda watched as the color drained from Reynolds' face, his hand tightening on her arm before. Finally, he released her. The tension in the alley had reached a fever pitch, and for a brief moment, everything hung in the balance. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, every nerve on high alert as she braced for whatever might come next. Reynolds took a step back, his face twisting with barely restrained fury as he glared at both her and Thomas. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, his voice low and venomous, before turning on his heel and stalking back down the alley, his footsteps echoing against the damp pavement. As he disappeared into the shadows, Amanda exhaled, the weight of the confrontation settling over her. She turned to Thomas, who looked as shaken as she felt, his gaze flicking nervously from her to the direction Reynolds had gone. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Amanda nodded, though her cheek still throbbed from the impact. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "You did the right thing." Thomas gave a hesitant nod, his face pale but resolute. "That guy, he's out of control," he murmured, shaking his head as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Someone has to do something." Amanda's jaw tightened, her resolve solidifying. "Believe me," she replied, her voice laced with determination. "Someone will." And as they stood together in the quiet alley, Amanda knew that this was only the beginning. She had faced down Officer Reynolds, but she sensed there was a much larger battle ahead. A fight not only against him, but against everything he represented. The steady hum of distant city traffic was the only sound that filled the air as Amanda and Officer Thomas remained in the quiet alley, still reeling from the confrontation that had just unfolded. The coldness of the night seemed sharper now, every shadow more profound, every whisper of wind more biting. Amanda could feel the residual tension from Reynolds' grip on her arm, the imprint of his fingers still throbbing on her skin. Her cheek ached where he had struck her, a sting that wasn't just physical but also emblematic of the indignity she had just endured. "Are you sure you're okay?" Thomas asked again, his voice low, his face marked with the unease of a young officer who just witnessed his superior crossing a dangerous line. Amanda gave him a small nod, though she knew that the bruises on her face and arm would only deepen with time. She had faced hostility before, but this encounter had left a bitter taste. "I'll be fine," she replied, her voice measured but resolute. "But Reynolds, he's not just a bad cop. This kind of behavior doesn't come out of nowhere." She could see the conflict in Thomas's eyes, his indecision over what to do next, as he processed her words. "Look," he said, swallowing hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard things about Reynolds. Stories that never made sense until now." He hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder as if expecting Reynolds to reappear. "But this?" He crossed a line. I can't ignore this." "Good," Amanda said firmly, feeling a flicker of hope as she studied him. "Because if there's more going on here, then it's bigger than just Reynolds. And if we're going to stop it, I need people who won't look the other way." Thomas opened his mouth as if to say something more when the sharp sound of approaching footsteps cut through the air. Both Amanda and Thomas turned toward the sound, their bodies tense as they braced for what might come next. Out of the shadows, Officer Reynolds reappeared, his face twisted in an expression of rage and disdain. It was as though the man had fed his anger during his brief absence, his fury now bubbling over, more volatile than before. He stopped a few feet away, glaring at Thomas, who seemed to shrink slightly under his superior's intense gaze. "I thought I told you to go back to your patrol, rookie," Reynolds snarled, his voice laced with venom. "Or do you think you're too good to follow orders?" Thomas hesitated, shifting his weight nervously. "Reynolds, what you did back there, it wasn't right. She didn't do anything wrong. You had no reason to." "Enough," Reynolds barked, his face flushed with anger. He took a threatening step toward Thomas, looming over him, his posture radiating authority and barely contained fury. "You think you're in a position to judge me? I've been on this force longer than you've been alive. Rookie, I know what I'm doing, and I don't need some green cop telling me otherwise." Thomas swallowed, his gaze flickering to Amanda for a brief moment before he squared his shoulders. "That doesn't make it right," he said, his voice quavering but resolute. "Just because you've been here longer doesn't mean you get to act however you want." Amanda could see the flicker of fear in Thomas's eyes, the uncertainty that he was trying so hard to mask, and her respect for him grew. It took courage to stand up to someone like Reynolds, and she knew he was risking more than he realized. But she also knew they couldn't afford to back down now, not with Reynolds' intentions so transparent. "Reynolds," Amanda interjected, her tone calm but firm, "you're crossing boundaries. If you don't stop now, you'll face serious consequences." But her words only seemed to fuel his anger further. Reynolds' gaze snapped to her, his eyes darkening as he took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "Consequences?" he sneered. "Don't think for a second that you can threaten me. You may think you're untouchable with your fancy lawyer friends and your high-profile cases, but out here, you're nothing." Amanda felt the familiar fire of determination flare within her. She was not about to let him undermine her or make her feel powerless. "If you think you can intimidate me, Officer Reynolds, you're wrong," she replied, each word measured and deliberate. "This ends here." Reynolds' face contorted with anger, and without warning, he reached out, grabbing her arm again, this time with a grip that felt like iron, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. The force of his hold jolted her, but she refused to flinch, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "Let go," Amanda commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. Reynolds didn't respond. Instead, his grip tightened further, and then, in a move that caught her off guard, he shoved her back against the brick wall. Pain exploded in her shoulder as she collided with the cold, unforgiving surface, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She could hear Thomas's sharp intake of breath, the rookie clearly shocked by the violent turn of events. "Reynolds!" Thomas's voice was filled with panic and anger as he took a step forward, fists clenched. "This is wrong. You can't treat her like this." But Reynolds barely spared him a glance. His focus remained fixed on Amanda, his face twisted into a cruel sneer. "You think you're so high and mighty," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "But out here, people like you don't get special treatment. Out here, I make the rules." Amanda forced herself to stay calm, her mind racing as she calculated her next move. She knew that resisting him physically would only escalate the situation, but she wasn't about to let him bully her into submission. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice laced with ice, "if you lay another hand on me, I will make sure that the entire city knows about this. You may think you're untouchable, but there are limits to what you can get away with." For a brief moment, Something flickered in Reynolds' eyes. A glint of uncertainty, perhaps, or even fear, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Replaced by the same steely rage, he tightened his grip on her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "I've been doing this job long enough to know how to handle people like you. You're just another arrogant lawyer, thinking you're above the law. But out here, your title means nothing." Amanda's pulse quickened, her anger rising with every word he spoke. She knew she couldn't let him intimidate her, couldn't let him undermine her sense of self-worth. She met his gaze head-on, her expression unflinching. "You don't scare me, officer," she replied coldly. "You're nothing more than a bully hiding behind a badge." In an instant, his face contorted with rage, and before she could brace herself, he struck her again, a swift, brutal slap that left her cheek stinging. The impact echoed through the narrow alley, a harsh, unforgiving sound that seemed to hang in the air long after his hand had pulled away. Amanda's head snapped to the side, her vision blurring momentarily from the force of the blow. Her cheek burned, the pain radiating across her face, but she forced herself to remain steady. Reynolds smirked, clearly pleased with himself, and for a moment, a triumphant glint appeared in his eyes. But Amanda was undeterred. Slowly, she turned back to face him, her gaze steady and unyielding, her resolve hardening with every passing second. "You just made a serious mistake," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a steely determination. "And I promise you, I will make sure you answer for it." Her words seemed to hit their mark, and she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a momentary crack in his facade. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He squared his shoulders, his face hardening as he took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice filled with barely contained fury. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." With that, he turned sharply on his heel, stalking back down the alley and disappearing into the shadows, leaving Amanda and Thomas alone in the quiet darkness. Thomas rushed to her side, his face pale with concern. "Are you all right? I should have done something. I should have stopped him." Amanda took a deep breath, the pain in her cheek throbbing, but she managed a small nod. "You did more than enough," she assured him. Standing up to him took courage, more than most would have. Thomas looked down, his expression conflicted. "He's been like this for years. Everyone knows it, but nobody does anything. It's like, he's untouchable." "Not anymore," Amanda replied, her voice hardening with resolve. "People like Reynolds thrive on fear and silence. But tonight, that changes. He's going to answer for what he did." As they stood together in the quiet alley, Amanda felt a renewed sense of purpose igniting within her. She had faced men like Reynolds before, men who used their power to intimidate and control. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. This time, she was going to fight back. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The alley was still and dark, the heavy silence pressing down on Amanda and Thomas as they watched Reynolds' retreating figure vanish into the night. Despite her calm exterior, Amanda's pulse was racing. Her cheek throbbed where he'd struck her, a painful reminder of the power dynamics that played out tonight. But she wasn't defeated, far from it. This encounter had only solidified her resolve to hold Reynolds accountable. Beside her, Thomas was visibly shaken. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his face pale under the streetlight's glow. The weight of what he'd witnessed was clearly bearing down on him, and Amanda could see the doubt and fear swirling in his eyes. This isn't right," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He shouldn't be able to get away with this. But you don't understand how things work here. Amanda, Reynolds, he's practically untouchable." Amanda met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Then it's time someone held him accountable, isn't it?" Thomas looked away, the conflict clear on his face. He was torn. She could tell, caught between his loyalty to the department and his sense of justice. But before he could respond, a new voice cut through the quiet, laced with irritation and authority. "Jacobs, Thomas, what's going on here?" Amanda turned to see another officer standing at the alley's entrance. She recognized him as Officer Harris, a senior member of the precinct and one of Reynolds' colleagues. His sharp eyes flicked between Amanda's bruised face and Thomas's troubled expression, a frown creasing his forehead. He stepped forward, his posture tense, clearly aware that something serious had transpired. "Harris," Thomas started, his voice strained. "It's Reynolds. He just—" Thomas struggled to find the words, glancing at Amanda as if hoping she could explain. But Amanda was done explaining. She lifted her chin, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Reynolds assaulted me, Officer Harris. He acted without provocation, using his badge as a weapon to intimidate and control. He crossed a line that should never be crossed by someone sworn to uphold the law." Harris's eyes narrowed as he took in her words, his expression a mix of disbelief and something darker, something that told her he wasn't pleased with this new complication. "Look, Ms. Jacobs," he said, his voice laced with a forced politeness. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Reynolds may be tough, but he knows how to handle himself. He wouldn't just—" "He slapped me, Officer Harris," Amanda interrupted, her gaze steady. "He laid his hands on me and tried to assert control by force, and Thomas here witnessed the entire thing." Harris's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face as he looked between Amanda and Thomas. Thomas, looking deeply uncomfortable, gave a nod, confirming her words. "It's true, Harris," he admitted, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Reynolds went too far." For a long moment, the alley was silent as Harris absorbed this information, the tension thickening. Amanda could see the wheels turning in his mind, his internal struggle between loyalty to his fellow officer and the undeniable truth before him. She knew that if he chose to protect Reynolds, she would be in for a much larger battle than she had anticipated. "Look," Harris finally said, his voice low and measured. "Reynolds has been on the force a long time. He knows how things work around here. Maybe he was out of line, but he's a good cop. We all make mistakes." His tone was apologetic, almost dismissive, as if a physical assault could be brushed off as a minor misstep. Amanda's jaw tightened. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "Is that what you call a blatant abuse of power?" Harris met her gaze, the challenge clear in his eyes. "Ms. Jacobs, you have to understand. People like Reynolds, they're on the front lines every day. They see things civilians don't. Sometimes, that pressure, it changes a person, makes them a bit rough around the edges." Amanda took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She'd heard this excuse before, the tired justification for why certain people felt entitled to bend the rules to fit their own sense of control. "And what about justice?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "What about the people who suffer because of that roughness? Are they just supposed to accept it as part of the job?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering back to Thomas, who stood silently beside her, his hands clenched into tight fists. "Thomas," he said, his tone almost pleading, "you're new here. You're still learning the ropes. You don't know what it's like to be out there day after day. Reynolds might have gone too far tonight, but he's not a bad cop. He's one of us." Thomas hesitated, his face a mix of frustration and doubt. He looked at Amanda, his expression conflicted, as though he was weighing his loyalty to his fellow officers against the truth he had just witnessed. But finally, he spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "I don't care how long he's been here, Harris," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "What he did tonight, it was wrong. We can't just look the other way." Harris's face hardened, the conflict giving way to irritation. "You have no idea what you're talking about, rookie," he snapped. "This isn't some ethics class or a courtroom. This is the real world. And in the real world, things get messy." Amanda took a step forward, her gaze piercing. "So that's it, then? You let men like Reynolds continue their abuse because it's messy? Because it's easier to look the other way?" Harris's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. The silence in the alley was thick, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavily between them. Amanda could see that Harris was torn, caught between his loyalty to Reynolds and the uncomfortable reality that his colleague had crossed a line. But as Harris opened his mouth to respond, another voice cut through the tension, low and venomous. "I see you're all still here." Amanda turned to see Reynolds approaching, his face twisted in a scowl, his eyes narrowed with a dark, unyielding anger. He stopped a few feet away, his posture radiating menace as he glared at Amanda and Thomas. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Reynolds demanded, his voice thick with contempt. Talking to her like she's one of us? She's just some lawyer who thinks she's better than everyone else. Amanda felt a spark of anger ignite within her, but she kept her tone calm. No, Officer Reynolds, she replied evenly. I'm just someone who believes that the law should be followed by everyone, including those who enforce it. Reynolds's face contorted with barely restrained rage, and he took a step toward her. But this time, Harris moved to block him, placing a hand on his chest to hold him back. That's enough, Reynolds, Harris said, his voice laced with warning. This isn't helping. Reynolds looked at Harris, his eyes flashing with fury. You're really going to take her side? He demanded, his voice incredulous. After all these years, you're going to let some lawyer tell us how to do our jobs? Harris hesitated, his gaze shifting to Amanda and Thomas. For a brief moment, he seemed to be weighing his options, caught between his loyalty to Reynolds and the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare. But then, slowly, he released his grip on Reynolds, stepping back to face him. I don't know what happened tonight, he said carefully, his tone measured. But maybe you did go too far. Maybe it's time to take a step back. Let this cool down. Reynolds's face twisted with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or the realization that his actions were catching up to him. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Not by a long shot. And with that, he turned on his heel, stalking back down the alley, leaving Amanda, Thomas, and Harris standing in the quiet darkness. Amanda let out a slow breath, the weight of the confrontation settling over her. She turned to Harris, her gaze steady. Thank you, she said quietly, though her tone held an edge of caution. I know this isn't easy for you. Harris looked away, a flicker of regret crossing his face. Don't thank me yet, he muttered. This is going to get messy. Reynolds, he's not one to let things go. Amanda nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. She knew that Reynolds wouldn't back down, that he would fight tooth and nail to protect his reputation and power. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now. She had come too far, and there was too much at stake. I'm ready, she said simply, her voice filled with resolve. Thomas looked at her, his expression a mix of admiration and fear. What happens now? He asked quietly. Amanda met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with determination. Now, she replied. Now, we make sure Reynolds, and everyone like him, is held accountable. As they stood together in the quiet alley, Amanda knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be treacherous, filled with obstacles and resistance, but she was prepared for the fight, ready to take on the corrupt system that allowed men like Reynolds to abuse their power. She was ready for justice, and she wasn't going to stop until she achieved it. Amanda returned to her apartment later that night, her mind spinning with the events that had unfolded in the dark alley. The reality of what had happened settled heavily over her, every bruise and throb on her face and arm reminding her of the price she would have to pay in the coming days. But she also felt an undercurrent of determination, a fierce resolve that had taken root during her confrontation with Reynolds. He might have thought he could intimidate her, that his badge and reputation could keep her quiet. But he had underestimated her. She had no intention of letting this go. The next morning, Amanda wasted no time. She made a series of calls, starting with her lawyer and a trusted journalist. The lawyer promised to file an official complaint against Officer Reynolds and gather evidence to support her case. But it was the journalist, Rachel Sandoval, who showed real interest, her voice crackling with energy and urgency. Amanda, Rachel said, her voice firm over the phone. If this is as big as it sounds, I want the story. Reynolds has been on our radar for years, but no one has ever dared to take him on. If you're serious about this, I'll do everything I can to get the word out. I'm dead serious, Rachel, Amanda replied, a steely edge to her voice. I want people to know who he is and what he's done, and I want to make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else. They agreed to meet later that afternoon at a discreet coffee shop, where Amanda would hand over preliminary evidence and share her story. It was a risky move. She knew that Reynolds would retaliate once he found out, but she wasn't backing down. She had felt his power, his cruelty, and she wasn't going to let that happen again. As she prepared for the meeting, a knock sounded at her door. Amanda's heart skipped a beat, and she approached the door cautiously. peering through the peephole. To her surprise, Officer Thomas stood in the hallway, looking both nervous and determined. "Thomas," she greeted him, opening the door, curiosity etched on her face. "What are you doing here?" Thomas hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. Once the door was closed, he took a deep breath, his expression tense but resolute. I had to come, Amanda," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Last night, what happened, it's been haunting me. I've seen things, heard things about Reynolds, but after witnessing what he did to you, I can't look the other way anymore. I don't care what it costs me. I'm willing to help you." Amanda's eyes softened, a mix of relief and gratitude flooding over her. "I appreciate this, Thomas. I know the risks you're taking by coming here." He shook his head. "The truth is, I was afraid of going against the system, of challenging someone as powerful as Reynolds. But I realize now, someone has to stand up to him. And if I don't, who will?" Amanda gave him a slight nod, understanding all too well the fear he was grappling with. "You're doing the right thing, Thomas. But know that once we start, there's no turning back. Reynolds will come after us, both of us." Thomas nodded, his face pale but determined. "I'm ready." Together, they sat at her kitchen table, discussing what had to happen next. Amanda knew she needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence that could expose Reynolds for who he truly was. And as Thomas shared what he knew, she realized that he could be the key to unlocking that evidence. "There's a file," Thomas said quietly, his eyes shifting to her. "Internal Affairs has a report on Reynolds. Complaints that never made it past his superiors. It's buried somewhere in the precinct's archives. I've seen it before. Back when I was going through orientation, they warned us not to ask questions. But I remember some of the details. If we could get our hands on that file, it could blow this whole thing wide open." Amanda's mind raced, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. If they could access the file, it would lend credibility to her complaint, providing proof that Reynolds' misconduct was known and buried. But it would require an insider's help, someone who could navigate the precinct without drawing suspicion. "Do you think you can get it?" she asked, her voice laced with cautious hope. Thomas hesitated, clearly aware of the risks. "I think so, but it won't be easy. They'll monitor everything, and if anyone finds out I'm snooping around, well, it won't end well." Amanda placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Only do this if you're certain, Thomas. I don't want you to risk your career for my sake." But Thomas shook his head, his jaw set. "This isn't just for you. It's for everyone he's hurt, everyone who's been silenced because of him. I'll get the file. Just be ready." They exchanged a determined nod, and Thomas left, his resolve seemingly stronger than before. Amanda felt a flicker of hope, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the confrontation in the alley. For the first time, she felt as though she wasn't fighting this battle alone. That afternoon, Amanda met Rachel at a secluded coffee shop downtown. They sat in a corner booth, the low murmur of surrounding conversations providing a perfect cover for their own. Rachel, with her no-nonsense demeanor and piercing gaze, was exactly the type of journalist Amanda needed on her side. She wasted no time, pulling out a recorder and her notepad as Amanda recounted the events of the previous night. "He was aggressive from the start," Amanda said, her voice steady but filled with underlying anger. "He grabbed me, struck me, and tried to use his authority to intimidate me into submission. And this isn't the first time he's done something like this. He's been protected by the department for years." Rachel listened intently, scribbling notes furiously, her eyes sparking with excitement. "And you have someone on the inside? An officer willing to corroborate your story?" Amanda nodded. "His name is Officer Thomas. He witnessed everything last night, and he's willing to help get the internal files that could expose Reynolds." Rachel's eyes gleamed with determination. "If we get our hands on those files, this will be more than just a story. It'll be a scandal, the kind that could force real change." But even as she spoke, Amanda felt a prickle of anxiety creeping over her. They were venturing into dangerous territory, threatening to expose not just Reynolds but the entire system that had enabled him. She knew that once they crossed this line, There would be no turning back. Rachel sensed her hesitation, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. Look, Amanda, I know this is dangerous, but I've seen people like Reynolds before. They thrive on fear, on the silence of people too afraid to speak out. By coming forward, you're challenging everything he stands for. And I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to make sure your story is heard. Amanda gave a slight nod, her resolve strengthening. Then let's do this. They agreed to meet again once Thomas obtained the files, parting with a sense of shared purpose and urgency. As Amanda walked back to her apartment, she could feel a faint glimmer of hope taking root. She was finally fighting back, chipping away at the wall of silence that had allowed men like Reynolds to operate unchecked. Later that evening, Amanda received a text from Thomas. It was brief, just 4 words. I have the files. Her heart raced as she read it, a mix of excitement and anxiety flooding over her. This was it, the proof she needed to expose Reynolds and, hopefully, the entire web of corruption that had protected him. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a park on the edge of town, secluded and quiet. Amanda arrived just after dusk, her breath fogging in the cool night air as she scanned the shadows for Thomas. She spotted him standing near a grove of trees, clutching a small envelope that seemed to pulse with the gravity of what it contained. "Did anyone see you?" she asked as she approached him. Her voice hushed. Thomas shook his head, though his face was pale, his expression tense. "I don't think so, but they'll know soon enough. Once they see these files missing, they'll connect the dots." Amanda took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. "This is the beginning, Thomas. Once this goes public, things will never be the same." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, but I'm ready. And if there's anything else you need, anything, just let me know." Amanda gave him a grateful smile, knowing how much he was risking for her. "Thank you, Thomas. I won't forget this." They parted in silence, each of them aware of the dangerous road ahead. Amanda returned home and spread the contents of the envelope across her desk. The documents were as damning as she'd hoped, filled with complaints and records of Reynolds' misconduct, all conveniently swept under the rug by his superiors. There were signed reports, witness statements, even notes from officers who had raised concerns, only to be silenced. Amanda felt a surge of triumph, tempered by a fierce determination. She had the evidence, and with Rachel's help, she would bring Reynolds, and everyone who had protected him, down. But as she organized the files, a chill ran down her spine. This was only the beginning. By taking on Reynolds, she was declaring war on the very institution that had shielded him for so long. She knew they wouldn't go down without a fight, that they would do everything in their power to silence her. But she was ready. For the first time, she felt as though the scales were tipping, and justice was within reach. The night stretched on as Amanda prepared for the battle ahead, the city outside her window gleaming with lights that cast long shadows. And as she looked out into the darkness, she knew that, come what may, she was finally ready to fight back. Amanda's fingers trembled slightly as she spread the documents across her desk, her apartment bathed in the dim glow of her desk lamp. Each sheet of paper, each hastily jotted note, and each formal complaint told a story of power abused, of complaints silenced, and of a system that had failed time and time again to protect its people. The envelope that Thomas had risked his career to obtain was a Pandora's box, and as Amanda pored over the contents, the full weight of her decision to pursue this case pressed down on her. It was worse than she had anticipated. The file contained a staggering number of complaints against Reynolds, accounts of excessive force, threats, intimidation tactics, and reports of misconduct from both civilians and fellow officers. Yet, each complaint was signed off as unsubstantiated or dismissed without thorough investigation, and each account of abuse was buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. It was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident or a single bad cop. This was a pattern, a culture that allowed men like Reynolds to thrive without consequence. One report, in particular, caught Amanda's attention. It was from a fellow officer, who had detailed an incident where Reynolds had assaulted a suspect during an arrest. Using more force than necessary, the officer had been disturbed enough to report it. but his complaint was marked as handled internally. A vague and empty assurance. Amanda clenched her jaw as she read, the injustice igniting a fire within her. This was more than misconduct, this was a cover-up. One that had been crafted with the kind of deliberate care that only came from those high up in the system. As Amanda sifted through the paperwork, her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. Let's meet ASAP. This is bigger than we thought. They had arranged to meet again at a small cafe. One Rachel frequented to avoid attention. Amanda gathered the most crucial documents, sliding them into her briefcase. She knew these files could change everything. But they were only the beginning. The deeper she went, the more she realized that exposing Reynolds would lead to something much larger and much more dangerous. At the cafe, Rachel was already waiting in a secluded corner, her laptop open and fingers flying across the keyboard. She looked up as Amanda approached. A gleam of excitement mingled with caution in her eyes. You were right, Rachel said as Amanda took her seat. These files, they're damning. Reynolds is practically a liability to the entire precinct. But they've been covering for him for years. Amanda nodded, her face set in grim determination. It's worse than that. These files show a pattern, a culture of silence and complicity. Reynolds isn't just one bad cop. He's part of a system that protects men like him. Rachel leaned back, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. If this gets out, it's going to rock the department. Maybe even the entire city. She paused, studying Amanda. But are you ready for what comes next? Because once we publish this, there's no going back. Amanda's gaze didn't waver. She'd anticipated this question. Knew Rachel would want reassurance before diving into something so high stakes. I'm ready, Rachel. They've protected him long enough. It's time for accountability. Rachel nodded, a glint of respect in her eyes. All right, we'll start by corroborating the evidence with anonymous sources. I'll work on drafting the story, and we'll get it out as soon as possible. But before they could discuss further, Amanda's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Feeling her pulse quicken, it was Thomas. She excused herself from the table and stepped outside, the cool air biting against her skin as she answered. Thomas? What's going on? Amanda. Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper, and there was an edge of fear in his tone. I think they know. Someone's onto me. My supervisor pulled me aside today, asked if I'd been asking questions. Amanda felt her heart skip a beat. She knew they were taking risks, but hearing Thomas's fear made it all feel more real, more immediate. Thomas, listen to me. Do you have any evidence that could tie you to the files? No, but they're watching me. I think Reynolds must have said something, or someone saw me. I don't know. But Amanda, they're going to try to shut us down. Amanda took a deep breath, her mind racing. Stay calm. Don't do anything that would draw attention. We're going to publish the story soon. Just hang in there, all right? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could hear Thomas's labored breathing as he struggled to steady himself. All right, just be careful. Amanda, they're not going to go down without a fight. They ended the call, and Amanda returned to the cafe, her resolve hardening. She shared the update with Rachel, who responded with a curt nod. If they're already suspicious, we need to act fast. I'll send this to my editor tonight. Get the legal team to review it. With any luck, we can have it published within the week. Amanda felt a thrill of both fear and determination at Rachel's words. It was happening. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd risked, was finally coming to fruition. But as she walked home that night, the shadows seemed darker, the city quieter. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that the consequences of her actions were already beginning to take shape. The following day, Amanda's world exploded. Rachel had sent her the first draft of the article, and it was every bit as damning as they had hoped. It was thorough, meticulously outlining Reynolds' history, the pattern of misconduct, and the evidence of a department willing to protect one of its own at any cost. The article, titled A Shield of Silence, The Abuse and Cover-Up Culture in Our Police Force, was set to go live in 48 hours. The moment it published, the city would be forced to confront the truth about the people sworn to protect it. Amanda barely had time to process the excitement when her phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her instincts telling her it could be a reporter or another anonymous source. Hello. There was a pause, and then a low, familiar voice filled her ear. Amanda Jacobs. It was Reynolds. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm, to keep her voice steady. Officer Reynolds. To what do I owe the pleasure? I know what you're doing, he said, his voice a barely restrained growl. And I'm telling you right now, this ends. You don't know who you're messing with. And if you think you can take me down, you're dead wrong. Amanda's grip tightened on the phone, her heart pounding, but she refused to let him intimidate her. I think you're the one who doesn't understand. Officer, your time is up. I have the evidence, the witnesses, everything I need to expose what you've done. Reynolds laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think that'll be enough? You think anyone's going to believe some lawyer who's out for revenge? You're just as naive as all the others who tried to come after me. And I'll tell you what I told them, walk away, because if you don't, you won't like what happens next. Amanda's voice was cold as ice. I'm not afraid of you, Reynolds. I faced men like you before, and I'm still standing. And once this story goes live, everyone will see you for who you really are. There was a pause, and she could hear the barely restrained rage in his voice as he spoke again. You have no idea who you're dealing with, but you're about to find out. Mark my words. Amanda, this isn't over. He ended the call abruptly, and Amanda stood in her kitchen, her pulse racing as the weight of his threat hung in the air. She knew that by taking this step, she had declared war not just on Reynolds, but on the entire system that had enabled him. And they would come for her, just as he'd warned. But she wasn't backing down. She had already come too far. That night, Amanda took every precaution. She double-checked her locks, turned off her phone's location services, and sent copies of the files to a trusted colleague for safekeeping. She knew they would try to silence her, to stop her from revealing the truth. But she was prepared. She'd been ready for this battle since the night Reynolds had struck her in the alley. As she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew what she was up against, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. Rachel, Thomas, and even her lawyer were all on her side, willing to fight with her. And in 2 days, the city would know the truth. Amanda closed her eyes, a sense of finality settling over her. This was only the beginning, and there would be more battles to come. But for the first time, she felt as though justice was within reach, as though the world was finally about to change. And no matter what happened, she would be ready. As the clock ticked down to the article's release, Amanda could feel the pressure closing in on her from all sides. Each passing hour brought new threats, new signs that those protecting Reynolds would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. She knew the risks, had anticipated the backlash. But now that it was unfolding around her, the weight of her decision was palpable. The morning before the article was set to go live, Amanda sat in her apartment, scrolling through the draft Rachel had sent her. Every word on the screen was loaded, each line damning. The story was a brutal exposé, detailing not only Reynolds' misconduct but also the department's complicity in covering up his crimes. It was exactly what she had wanted, raw, unfiltered truth. Yet, the gravity of what she was about to unleash sent a cold shiver down her spine. The quiet of her apartment was shattered by the sudden buzz of her phone. Amanda glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Her pulse quickened, instincts warning her of potential trouble. Taking a steadying breath, she answered. Hello. There was a brief silence. Then a low voice spoke. Ms. Jacobs, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Amanda felt her spine stiffen, a familiar sense of dread creeping over her. Who is this? The voice chuckled, the sound cold and threatening. Just someone who's been watching you very closely. I know what you're planning to do, and I'm telling you now, back off. Take down that article, or there will be consequences. Her grip tightened on the phone, anger replacing her initial fear. I'm not backing down. You can make all the threats you want, but the truth is coming out. Whether you like it or not. The voice shifted, turning icy. People like you think you're untouchable. But I assure you, you're not. Walk away now, Ms. Jacobs, or you'll find out just how powerful your enemies really are. The call ended abruptly, leaving Amanda standing in the middle of her apartment. A mix of anger and defiance coursing through her. She knew they wouldn't make this easy. Exposing Reynolds and the corruption surrounding him was a direct threat to those in power. But she hadn't come this far to be intimidated into silence. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again this time. It was Rachel. Amanda answered, her voice edged with tension. Rachel, I just got another threat. They're getting desperate. Rachel's voice was calm, resolute. That means we're close. Amanda, they're feeling the pressure. Which means we're doing something right. Are you still in? Absolutely. Amanda replied without hesitation. Let's move forward. Rachel let out a relieved breath. Good. The article is scheduled to go live at noon tomorrow. Our editor is backing us up. And the legal team says we're clear. But I'll be honest, once this hits, the backlash will be intense. I'm ready, Amanda assured her, though the knot in her stomach betrayed her nerves. She knew that tomorrow would be a turning point. Once the article was published, there would be no going back. That night, Amanda took extra precautions. Knowing that those who wanted to silence her were becoming more desperate, she double-checked the locks on her doors and windows, moved her sensitive files to a secure location, and sent copies of everything to her lawyer and a close colleague, ensuring that no matter what happened, the truth would be preserved. Despite her efforts, an uneasy feeling lingered, a sense that danger was lurking just beyond her door. She tried to sleep, but every creak of the apartment building, every shadow cast by passing headlights outside, kept her alert, her mind racing with the possibilities, the threats, the intimidation. She knew they were a last-ditch effort to scare her into submission. But instead of backing down, they only strengthened her resolve. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Amanda rose, exhausted but determined. She dressed carefully, steeling herself for the day ahead. It was time to face whatever came her way. Hours later, Amanda sat in a bustling cafe downtown, waiting for Rachel and Thomas. She'd suggested meeting in a public place, knowing that the presence of others would offer a layer of protection. She kept her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room, alert for any sign of trouble. The morning's unease hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger with each passing hour. Rachel arrived first, her expression tense but composed. She slid into the booth across from Amanda, setting her bag down with a sigh. Are you holding up okay? Amanda managed a tight smile. Barely, but I'm ready for this. Have there been any updates? Rachel nodded. The article is already getting attention internally. The newsrooms received anonymous calls, people trying to discredit you and the witnesses. It's only a matter of time before they go public with their attacks. I expected as much, Amanda said, her voice steely. Let them try. Just then, Thomas entered the cafe, glancing around until he spotted them. He looked uneasy, his posture tense as he slid into the booth beside Rachel. Sorry I'm late, he murmured, his voice laced with anxiety. I think I was followed. Amanda and Rachel exchanged a worried glance. Did you see who it was? Rachel asked, her tone serious. Thomas shook his head, looking over his shoulder as though expecting to see someone watching him. No, but I felt it. Everywhere I went, there was this same car, just far enough back that it wasn't obvious. They're watching us. Amanda, they know something's about to happen. Rachel's gaze sharpened, a fierce determination flashing in her eyes. Then they're going to have a hard time stopping it. The story is airtight. They can try to discredit it, but the evidence is there. Amanda nodded, grateful for Rachel's conviction. No matter what happens today, we're seeing this through. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their mission heavy in the air. Then Rachel broke the silence, her voice low and serious. Listen, once this article goes live, everything changes. The people protecting Reynolds won't take this lying down. They'll come after you. Me, Thomas, anyone connected to this story. We need to be prepared for that. Thomas swallowed, his face pale but determined. I knew what I was signing up for. I'm ready. Amanda took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then let's do this. Rachel checked her watch, then met Amanda's gaze. Noon. That's when it hits. I'll head back to the newsroom to make sure everything goes smoothly. You too. Stay safe and stay in contact. We're going to need each other in the days ahead. They parted with tense nods, each of them keenly aware of the storm they were about to unleash. As noon approached, Amanda returned to her apartment. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, she closed the blinds, her heart pounding as the clock ticked closer to the article's release. She checked her phone obsessively, waiting for the notification that would confirm the story was live. Each second felt like an eternity, the weight of anticipation pressing down on her. Finally, at exactly noon, her phone buzzed with an alert. She opened it, her breath catching as she read the headline, "A Shield of Silence, the Abuse and Cover-Up Culture in Our Police Force." The article was live. Rachel had done it. Everything was out in the open now, exposed for the world to see. Amanda's heart pounded as she read the first lines. Rachel's words sharp and unyielding as they painted a damning portrait of Reynolds and the department that had protected him. But even as she felt a surge of triumph, her phone buzzed with another call. This time, it was her lawyer. Amanda. His voice was tense, urgent. They're already retaliating. There's been a formal request from the department to investigate you. Claims of misconduct. Accusations that you tampered with evidence. They're pulling out all the stops to discredit you. Amanda's jaw tightened. She'd expected as much. But the speed and intensity of their response made her pulse quicken. Let them try. We have the evidence to back up everything we've said. Her lawyer hesitated. Yes, but you need to be careful. This isn't just about discrediting you. They're trying to put you on the defensive, to drain your resources and keep you distracted. They're going to make this as difficult as possible. Amanda swallowed, a mixture of anger and defiance rising within her. I'm ready for it. Let them come. I'm not backing down. They ended the call, and Amanda stared at her phone, a new wave of determination coursing through her. She knew the fight was just beginning. The article was out, but now she would have to endure the backlash, the counterattacks, the attempts to smear her name and reputation. The hours that followed were a blur. News outlets began picking up the story. Social media erupted with reactions. And within hours, the city was ablaze with discussions of the article. Supporters reached out, sending messages of encouragement. But so did the detractors, messages of hate, threats, and accusations from those who refused to believe the truth. As night fell, Amanda felt both exhausted and invigorated. She knew that she was facing an uphill battle, that her life would never be the same. But she also knew that she had taken the first step in a fight that would ripple through the entire system. And as she looked out at the city lights twinkling beyond her window, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had done it. The truth was out, and nothing could erase it now. The war was far from over, but Amanda was ready for whatever came next. She had set the stage, taken the first shot, and exposed the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. She was in this fight until the very end. The morning after the article went live, Amanda woke to a world transformed. Her phone was flooded with notifications, emails, text messages, missed calls. Her inbox was bursting with messages from strangers, journalists, supporters, and detractors. Some were from people thanking her for her bravery, recounting their own experiences with officers like Reynolds, while others were thinly veiled threats, accusing her of slandering good cops and warning her to watch her back. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. This was the storm she had expected. For every supporter, there were voices screaming in opposition, voices that refused to believe in a broken system. But beneath the chaos, Amanda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had stirred something deep within the city, a reckoning that would be hard to stop. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen to see Rachel's name flashing. she answered, her voice edged with tension. Rachel. Rachel's voice was brisk, professional but tinged with urgency. Amanda, the story is blowing up. Every major outlet is picking it up. We've already received a response from the department. They're calling for an internal investigation. But you know what that means. They're trying to control the narrative. Get out in front of this before it spirals out of their control. Amanda's stomach tightened. She knew that an internal investigation would likely be little more than a public show. A way for the department to appear proactive while carefully redirecting attention away from the deeper issues. So they're looking to bury this before it gains too much traction? Exactly, Rachel replied. They're hoping to sweep it under the rug. Make it look like a one-time issue with Reynolds. Rather than a systemic problem. They're going to put all the blame on him. Let him be the scapegoat. The realization made Amanda's blood boil. Reynolds was a problem. Yes. But he was only a symptom of a much larger disease. If the department managed to isolate him, pin everything on him alone, the underlying culture that had enabled him would remain unchallenged. Rachel, we can't let that happen, Amanda said, her voice fierce with conviction. We need to show people that this isn't just about one bad cop. It's about an entire system that protected him. Rachel was silent for a moment, her mind clearly racing. Then we need more witnesses, more officers willing to go on the record. We need to dig deeper. Amanda considered this, her thoughts turning to Thomas. He had already risked so much to get her the files, but now she needed him more than ever. He was one of the few insiders who understood the stakes and had the courage to stand up against the forces he once served. She knew it was dangerous to involve him further, but if she was going to expose the full truth, she needed his help. I'll talk to Thomas, she said finally. If he's willing, he might be able to find more officers who can corroborate what we found in the files. Rachel let out a sigh of relief. Good. And Amanda, stay safe. There are a lot of people who want to see you fail. Amanda thanked her, and they ended the call. She knew Rachel was right. The deeper she dug, the greater the risk. But she wasn't about to give up. She had come too far to let the department brush this aside. That afternoon, Amanda met Thomas in a small, quiet diner on the outskirts of town. He looked tired, the weight of the past few days evident in his drawn features and the dark circles beneath his eyes. But his resolve was still there, glimmering beneath the fatigue. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice low as he sipped his coffee. I mean, going after more than Reynolds? This isn't just dangerous. Amanda, it's suicide. Amanda's gaze was steady, her determination unwavering. It's the only way, Thomas. If we don't go after the whole system, they'll just keep protecting him. Reynolds will be a scapegoat, and nothing will change. He nodded, though she could see the fear lurking in his eyes. I know some officers, good people who have been afraid to speak out. I can try to convince them, but it won't be easy. Some of them have families, mortgages, they can't afford to lose their jobs. Amanda reached across the table, her hand resting on his. Tell them this isn't just about one person. It's about changing a system that's hurting everyone. And let them know that they won't be alone. We're in this together. Thomas looked down at her hand, nodding slowly. All right, I'll try. He glanced around the diner, lowering his voice even further. But be careful, Amanda. They're watching us. I've noticed unmarked cars outside my apartment. And I know they've been following you too. Amanda's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to remain calm. Let them watch. We're not hiding. They exchanged a look of shared determination, a silent understanding of the danger they were courting. They both knew that by digging deeper, they were stepping into dangerous territory, poking at the very heart of a corrupt institution. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and fear. Amanda found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, acutely aware of every unmarked car that lingered outside her building, every unfamiliar face that seemed to follow her on the street. She received more calls, some anonymous threats, others from strangers sharing their own encounters with police misconduct. each story a chilling reminder of the darkness they were fighting. One evening, as Amanda sat at her kitchen table, organizing the latest evidence Rachel had gathered, she heard a soft knock on her door. Her heart skipped a beat, every instinct telling her to be cautious. She checked the peephole, relief washing over her when she saw that it was Thomas. She opened the door, gesturing for him to enter, but as he stepped inside, she noticed a deep bruise on his cheek, his lips swollen. "Thomas, what happened?" He avoided her gaze, his voice barely a whisper. "They cornered me after my shift. 2 guys from the department. They didn't say much, just warned me to back off." Amanda's hands clenched into fists, anger boiling within her. "They're trying to intimidate you." Thomas nodded, his expression haunted. "They think a few threats will scare us away, but it's just made me more determined." He met her gaze, a spark of defiance lighting his tired eyes. "Amanda, I've got 2 officers willing to go on the record. They've seen things, just like I have. They're ready to talk." Amanda's heart swelled with relief and gratitude. "This is huge, Thomas. With more testimonies, they won't be able to deny the truth." Thomas gave a grim nod. "But we need to move fast. They're closing in. Amanda, I don't know how much longer we have." The following morning, Amanda and Rachel met with the 2 officers, both of whom looked as though they hadn't slept in days. Their faces were pale, their expressions grim, but there was a quiet resolve about them. They had seen enough corruption, enough abuse of power, and they were ready to break their silence. As Amanda recorded their statements, they recounted chilling details, accounts of cover-ups, stories of intimidation tactics used against civilians, and the pervasive fear of retribution that kept everyone in line. Each word they spoke added fuel to Amanda's fire, solidifying her commitment to expose the truth. Once the statements were recorded, Rachel packed up her equipment, her eyes alight with the urgency of their mission. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This will give us the leverage we need to go after the department. They won't be able to ignore this." Amanda's heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread. "Let's do it." That night, Amanda returned home, feeling the weight of her decision settle heavily on her shoulders. She knew that they were close, that the story they were about to release would send shockwaves through the entire city. But she also knew that their enemies would do everything in their power to stop them. As she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with another message. It was from an unknown number, but the words chilled her to the core. "Last warning. Jacobs, walk away, or you'll regret it." Amanda took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. She knew the stakes, knew the danger, but she couldn't turn back now. She had come too far, risked too much. With a determined look, she deleted the message, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. The city outside was quiet, the lights casting long shadows across her room. And as Amanda lay awake, staring into the darkness, she felt a fierce sense of resolve. Tomorrow, they would release the next story, and the truth would break through the silence that had shrouded the department for so long. This was only the beginning, but Amanda was ready for the fight. No matter what came next, she would see this through. As Amanda moved through her day, it became clear that the walls were closing in. The morning was heavy with the anticipation of the article's second part, a direct attack on the police department's culture of cover-ups and the corruption that had allowed Reynolds to thrive. The weight of what she was about to release hung over her, casting a shadow over every step, every breath. She knew that once the story went public, the department would stop at nothing to silence her. She had planned everything meticulously. Rachel was finalizing the article, adding statements from the 2 brave officers who had come forward to corroborate Reynolds' abuses and reveal the systemic issues in the precinct. Thomas was preparing to speak out too, a move that could cost him everything but one he felt was necessary to make lasting change. Despite the risks, Amanda's resolve remained unbreakable. But as noon approached, she received a call that sent her pulse racing. It was her lawyer, his voice tense. "Amanda, there's been a sudden push from the DA's office to launch an investigation against you. They're alleging misconduct, accusing you of falsifying evidence. It's clear they're trying to smear your name, but they're serious. This is their last-ditch effort to discredit you. The news hit her like a blow. Can they do this? Launch a baseless investigation just to tarnish my reputation? Normally, no. But these are desperate people. Amanda, they're using every tool at their disposal to slow you down. They're banking on fear and public doubt to discredit everything you've worked for. But if we're careful, we can counter this. Amanda took a deep breath, clenching her fists to steady herself. What do I need to do? Just be prepared. I'll handle as much of it as I can. But they're going to throw everything at you to create a media storm and pull attention away from your story. Be ready to fight back. They ended the call, and Amanda leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. She knew this was coming, had anticipated their attempts to shut her down. But the speed and intensity of their retaliation was staggering. She couldn't let them win, couldn't allow fear to derail her. At noon, Amanda, Thomas, and Rachel met in the office of a small independent news outlet that had agreed to publish the story. The office buzzed with anticipation, staff moving briskly through the narrow corridors, whispers and hurried footsteps echoing off the walls. The stakes were high. Everyone knew it. They were about to release a story that would shake the city to its core. Rachel sat at her desk, clicking through the final edits on the article. "We're almost ready," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "As soon as I hit publish, this will be out there for the world to see." Thomas nodded, though Amanda could see the tension etched in his face. He'd been quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly occupied with the weight of what was about to happen. Amanda placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Thomas. This will help so many people." He offered a faint smile. "I know, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't terrified." Amanda understood. She was terrified too. But this was the moment they'd been working toward, the culmination of their sacrifices, and they couldn't back down now. Rachel glanced at the clock, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Are we ready?" Amanda and Thomas exchanged a final look, both of them nodding in silent agreement. "Do it," Amanda said. Rachel clicked a final button, her face illuminated by the screen as she hit publish. In an instant, the story was live. Within minutes, the news began to spread like wildfire. Phones rang, notifications buzzed, and social media exploded with reactions to the article. The story was brutal in its honesty, detailing the abuses of power, the culture of silence within the department, and the systemic failures that had protected Reynolds. Statements from the officers and Thomas's testimony made the piece unassailable, each word a hammer blow against the carefully constructed facade of the department. But as Amanda watched the reactions pour in, her phone buzzed with a new notification. She opened it and saw that the DA's office had issued a public statement, announcing an official investigation into her for alleged misconduct. The timing was blatant, an attempt to distract and discredit her as the article took hold. She felt a surge of anger but forced herself to remain calm. "They're moving faster than we thought," she said to Rachel and Thomas, showing them the statement. Rachel's jaw tightened. "They're panicking. They know the story is too powerful to ignore, so they're throwing everything at you to shift the focus." Amanda squared her shoulders. "Then we'll keep pushing. They can investigate me all they want, but they can't erase the truth." The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Media outlets picked up the DA's statement, spreading rumors and casting doubt on Amanda's credibility. Reporters called her phone, asking for comments, while others speculated on talk shows and online about the legitimacy of her claims. It was a coordinated attack, a desperate effort to drown out the truth with a flood of misinformation. Amanda fielded calls from supporters and critics alike, the constant onslaught wearing her down. But she remained steadfast, answering questions with calm resolve, refusing to let them see her fear. She knew that the fight had reached a critical point, that this was their attempt to destroy her before she could do more damage. Late in the afternoon, she received a message from an anonymous number. "Meet me at the old train station tonight. I have information that could help you." Amanda stared at the message, her instincts screaming caution. Could be a trap, a way to lure her into danger. But it could also be the key to something bigger, evidence that would turn the tide in her favor. She weighed her options, finally deciding to go but with backup. She called Thomas, explaining the situation. I don't know if it's legitimate, but I have to see what they have. Thomas hesitated, his voice tinged with worry. Are you sure? Could be dangerous. I know, she replied, her voice firm. But if this is real, could change everything. That night, Amanda made her way to the old train station, a forgotten relic on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with tension, the stillness broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She felt the weight of each step, her senses on high alert as she scanned the darkened platform for any sign of movement. Thomas was nearby, watching her from a distance in case anything went wrong. She knew he was just as nervous as she was, but his presence gave her a sense of reassurance. She wasn't in this alone. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light cast by a lone street lamp. Amanda's pulse quickened as she recognized the man. It was Officer Harris, one of Reynolds' close colleagues. Amanda Jacobs, he said, his voice low, cautious. You've made quite a mess, haven't you? Amanda braced herself, keeping her tone steady. If by mess you mean exposing the truth, then yes. What do you want? Harris. He glanced over his shoulder, his face etched with tension. I didn't come here to threaten you. I came to help. In my own way. Things have gotten out of hand. Reynolds isn't just a problem for you, he's a problem for us. For everyone who ever covered for him. He's a loose cannon, and he's dragging us all down with him. Amanda narrowed her eyes, studying him carefully. So you're here to save yourself. Harris didn't deny it. Maybe, but I can give you something that will help us both. Evidence. Real evidence. That Reynolds has been covering his tracks for years. Enough to ensure he's never protected again. Her mind raced, a mixture of suspicion and hope flaring within her. Why now? Why not turn him in when you first saw what he was doing? Harris looked away, his jaw clenched. Fear, loyalty, stupidity, pick a reason. But if he goes down, I know what's coming next. I'm not going to fall with him. This is your chance to take him out for good. And I'm willing to help you do it. Amanda took a breath, her voice barely a whisper. What do you have? He handed her a small, encrypted USB drive. Everything. Internal emails, hidden complaint files, records that were supposed to be destroyed. He was careless. Keep this close and make sure it gets out. She took the drive, feeling the weight of it in her hand. This was what she needed, proof. Undeniable evidence of Reynolds' corruption and the network that had shielded him. Harris gave her a last, fleeting look, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. Good luck, Jacobs. You're going to need it. With that, he melted back into the shadows, leaving Amanda standing alone, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand. As she returned to her apartment, Amanda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the fight wasn't over, that there would be more obstacles, more threats, but now she held the key to bringing down not just Reynolds, but the entire system that had enabled him. The evidence she'd been given was dangerous, a Pandora's box that could reshape the city's understanding of justice and corruption. But she was ready to open it, no matter the consequences. Tomorrow, she would meet with Rachel, share the new evidence, and together they would release the truth into the world. Whatever came next, Amanda was prepared. She was no longer just a lawyer fighting for justice. She was a force of reckoning, and she would see this through to the very end. Amanda's heart raced as she sat across from Rachel in the small, windowless office of the independent newsroom. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came before a storm. The USB drive Harris had given her felt like a lead weight in her pocket, heavy with the power it held to expose everything Reynolds' abuse, the cover-ups, and the complicity of those around him. She'd been fighting this battle for weeks, but now she was closer than ever to the endgame. Rachel looked at her with intense focus, her fingers hovering over her laptop as she prepared to review the files. Are you ready? She asked. her voice barely above a whisper. Amanda nodded, swallowing the anxiety that was clawing at her throat. As ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this. With a final breath, she handed over the USB drive. Rachel plugged it into her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen's glow as she began to open the files. Amanda leaned forward, her hands clenched as they sifted through the contents. The screen revealed a maze of hidden records, incriminating emails, and reports that had been carefully swept under the rug. "Oh my God," Rachel breathed, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the evidence. "This isn't just Reynolds. This implicates half the precinct. They've been covering for him, falsifying records, silencing witnesses. This goes all the way to the top." Amanda felt a surge of grim satisfaction, mixed with the heavy responsibility of what they were about to unleash. The public needs to see this. They deserve to know the truth. Rachel's fingers flew over the keyboard as she organized the files, piecing together a timeline of corruption and cover-ups that spanned years. She added this new evidence to the article, crafting it into a narrative so damning that it would be impossible to ignore. For the first time, Amanda felt that they had a real chance at taking down not just Reynolds, but the entire system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. As they worked, the tension in the room grew, each keystroke pushing them closer to a confrontation they could not avoid. Every moment felt stretched, heavy with the knowledge that what they were doing was dangerous, that there were people watching, waiting to strike back. The clock ticked closer to noon, the hour they had set to release the updated article with the new evidence. Rachel finished typing the final paragraph and leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "This is it. Once I hit publish, there's no going back." Amanda nodded, her gaze steady. "Do it." With a single click, Rachel published the article, setting off a chain reaction that would ripple through the entire city. The backlash was immediate. Within minutes of the article going live, Amanda's phone exploded with notifications. Journalists from major networks reached out, requesting interviews, while social media ignited with comments and shares. But along with the support came a barrage of attacks, accusations from anonymous accounts, and veiled threats warning her to stop. Rachel received a call from her editor, his voice taut with urgency. "You two have stirred up a hornet's nest. The precinct is in chaos, and the mayor's office is demanding answers. Stay put and keep a low profile. This is only going to get worse." Amanda and Rachel exchanged a tense look, aware that the city was now a powder keg, and they had just lit the fuse. Thomas called moments later, his voice shaky but filled with excitement. "Amanda, the precinct's buzzing. They're scrambling, panicking. Some of the officers have already gone on record, distancing themselves from Reynolds. I think we've actually done it." But as Amanda hung up, a creeping sense of unease settled over her. She knew they had struck a blow, but she also knew that men like Reynolds and the people protecting him didn't go down quietly. Her instincts told her that the fight was far from over. That night, Amanda stayed at a safe house provided by a colleague, her location known only to a trusted few. She knew she couldn't return to her apartment. It was too risky, too obvious. The threats had escalated, and she could no longer ignore the very real danger she faced. The safe house was small and sparsely furnished, its windows covered, every shadow seeming to pulse with unseen threats. She barely slept, every sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You think you're safe? You're not. This isn't over." She read the words, a chill running down her spine. She knew it could be Reynolds himself or someone from the precinct who resented the exposure. But whoever it was, they were angry and dangerous. The next morning, Rachel contacted her, the urgency in her voice unmistakable. "Amanda, I just received word from a reliable source. They're planning a formal counterattack, some kind of smear campaign, to discredit you, me, and Thomas. They're not going to let this go without a fight." Amanda gritted her teeth, steeling herself. "They can try, but we have the truth on our side. They're desperate. Amanda, they've already circulated rumors that you falsified evidence and coerced witnesses. They're playing dirty, hoping to create enough doubt to keep people from seeing the truth." Amanda's pulse quickened. anger flaring within her. She had anticipated a response. But the sheer scale of their retaliation took her breath away. "We can counter it," she said, her voice firm. "We'll release more evidence if we have to. We won't let them silence us." That afternoon, Amanda met with Thomas in a discreet location. He looked haggard, the strain of the past few weeks evident in his drawn features. "I can't go back to the precinct," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They know I'm involved. Some of the officers have already turned on me, calling me a traitor. I don't know what's going to happen." Amanda placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Thomas. You stood up for what was right, and that takes courage. No matter what happens, remember that." He nodded, though his face remained clouded with worry. "Do you think it will be enough? Do you think we'll actually be able to change things?" Amanda's gaze was steady. "We have to believe that we can. The truth is out there now, and they can't erase it." As they parted, Amanda felt a surge of resolve. She was tired, worn down from the endless battle, but she knew she couldn't stop now. The city was finally paying attention, the facade cracking, and she was determined to see it through to the end. By nightfall, Amanda returned to the safe house, her thoughts swirling as she replayed the events of the day. The city was in uproar, and she could feel the mounting pressure from all sides. But even as she steeled herself for the fight ahead, a sense of calm settled over her. She had exposed the truth, shattered the silence that had protected Reynolds and those like him. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew she had taken a stand. As she lay awake, her phone buzzed again with a message from Rachel. "We did it, Amanda. They're already talking about an independent investigation. The city's waking up." Amanda felt a surge of hope, a rare flicker of optimism breaking through the darkness. She had ignited something powerful, something that couldn't be easily extinguished. The truth was out, and it was spreading, gathering strength with every passing hour. She drifted off to sleep with a sense of peace, knowing that no matter what came next, she had taken the first step toward change. She had confronted the darkness, exposed the rot at its core, and given a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. This was only the beginning, but Amanda was ready for whatever lay ahead. She would fight, she would endure, and she would see justice served.